And many, many thanks to the Center for Political Education for this programming. This series, Writing the Third World, was a dream that I had a while ago, and Thomas and Hasmin have brought to fruition. And so I'm really thrilled to be able to participate in it. And I'm so excited about so much of what the Center for Political Education does, honestly. I think the period that we're in, I feel like I say this every single year, but it's just been true. So I'm going to keep saying it, that the period that we're in is really disorienting and it's very hard to make sense of. And the center is a very, very important resource in terms of helping us think critically and expansively about interpreting the world and changing it. Christina, what do you think is great about the center?
Well, I would agree with all of that. And, I'm so delighted to be in dialogue with you for this event. And I also want to echo my thanks for Hasmin and Thomas and Leah and Yaya and Mary and everybody who made this possible. This is such a perfect place to kind of unofficially launch my book, Making Internationalism, or at least talk about it, because the book is about organizing education, finding meaning through radical collaboration, all work that CPE does day in, day out. Anybody who's on this call or watching this webinar knows that it's a hard moment to teach. It's a hard moment to think. It's a hard moment to learn, especially when, like you said, the world's on fire. Everybody feels totally stretched thin and burned out. But I just want to reiterate the mission statement of CPE. Like Hasmin says, we do it because, like CPA says, the movements are strongest when their organizing and activism are grounded in historical knowledge, strong theory, and rigorous analysis. And I'm so deeply appreciative of the work that CPE does, and I'm so happy to be here with you tonight.
So I hope that you are also very thankful for the work that CPE does. And we're going to just go right out the gate and ask you for money. So just there in the chat, I've dropped the link where you can give online. I am a monthly donor to the center, and it is one of the, I think, kind of easiest ways to be in good financial support of the organization. It just rolls on in the background, and I know that some little amount is going to the organization every single month to help do things like pay for fancy Zoom so that we can have webinars, and to make sure that people get compensated for interpretation and captioning, and to make sure that we can help provide living wage to the people who do the work to put these things together. All of those things are really crucial. And because they can't happen without some financial support, I'm just going to leave that link hanging out there for a second. I know it takes a second to click on it, takes a second to go and fill in your little information. My hope is that most of you are giving already, and so it will be a very quick transaction. But even if you give, now's another time, another opportunity to do the good work that helps support the good work of CPE. So I'm going to give, the work is not affiliated with CPE USA. No, that is incorrect. So I am going to encourage you also to use the Q&A if you have questions throughout. We're not going to have a separate Q&A portion of the conversation, but Christina and I will do our best to try to incorporate the things that are coming up throughout. If you have kind of random thoughts in the chat, I will not be responding to every chat. I just set a bad precedent by doing that. But if there are other things going on there, we may reference those, but really we'll be focusing most on the Q&A. So I hope at this point you are all a little bit lighter in the pocketbook. And with that, let's get into talking, Christina. What Hasmin did not mention about me, and I think my bio should just include, is that I am a rabid Christina Heatherton super fan. Like, I cannot get enough of Christina's work. And I feel like you are one of the clearest thinkers, Christina, like a very, very complex, nuanced thinker, but you also are really, really clear. And you're so smart and skilled at articulating very, very complex, nuanced ideas in direct ways that people like me can understand. And I'm grateful for the work that you do. I feel like I should get like a satin jacket done up, you know, with your face on the back of it or something. But the amount of kind of fandom and badgering I have given Christina about this book in particular is probably uncomfortable, too close for comfort. But it makes me so thrilled to be in conversation with you about it tonight. And, you know, I'll be first in line next year, beating down the doors of UC Press. So let's talk about making internationalism, global radicalism in the era of the Mexican Revolution. And I would like to start, if you don't mind, Christina, with just you breaking the book down a little bit for us. Like, what is this book? And if you could, while you're talking about that, also give us a sense of kind of what is internationalism in the way that it's discussed in your book, and why is it so crucial, do you think, for people to be engaging with as a concept?
Okay, great. I feel like I have to let my blushing dissipate before I can start talking. I want to say, first of all, just something about the fandom, because it's totally mutual. This is, if you've tuned in, this is actually a disgusting love fest up here between me and Rachel. I'm an enormous fan of Rachel, and you know, you said badgering. This book was written with your voice in my head for multiple reasons, both because you're somebody I have so much respect for, and also because every year you would say, can you do a book event with CPE? And every year I'd have to say, it's not quite done yet. It's not quite done. So this is like a long time in the making, and I'm so delighted to finally be doing this. So the book, so international. And, you know, I want to be clear too, that, you know, we thought about tonight as a conversation. So I'll say a little bit about the book, and I'll be really curious to hear, you know, your thoughts about why internationalism is such an important concept, why you wanted this book done, you know, why your voice has been in my damn head for so many years. So let me try to answer some of your questions. So it's a big book, Making Internationalism. And boy, I feel you asked me 5 questions and they all fell out of my head. But the kind of brief overview of it is, I'm interested in how internationalism is made. And so the title really comes from, I think, 2 different strands. It's a debt to social history. You know, I'm very influenced in the kind of trajectories that produce things like the making of the English working class. But, you know, I'm also a student of Black studies, of ethnic studies, of American studies. So I'm interested in making as a process that's, you know, as we're talking about today, writing from the third world. You know, I'm interested in how people make meaning, teach each other, collaborate in the spaces that they find themselves in. And I'm really interested in tracking that process across time, over a very long span of time. So every chapter in the book talks about the making of something. The introduction is called How to Make a Rope. And it's a political economy of a lynch rope. And so I think about where all the strands that come to produce a lynch rope in the early 20th century came from. Some of them came from the Philippines, a fiber called abaca or manila, that were related to the U.S. imperial control over the Philippines. Some fibers came from domestic Jim Crow sharecropping regimes, domestically produced cotton or hemp. You know, obviously I'm very interested in the fibers that came from southern Mexico, sisal and henequen. And I'm very interested in tracing the kind of political economy of how all these strands were woven together. And so the introduction kind of like goes forward and goes backwards and says, like, you know, here's how we can think about the convergence of these different kinds of capitalist, imperialist, colonial types of control by thinking about how they're woven together in strands of what becomes a lynch rope. But also by unbraiding those strands, we can think backwards and understand a world united in struggle. And so, you know, my book is about how the internationalization of capital produced an internationalist consciousness. So I'm really interested in how, for example, in unbraiding those strands, you can think about ways that, for example, indigenous workers in southern Mexico, workers in Chicago factories, indigenous people in the plains of the United States, how their struggles can also be understood as interwoven and converging. So gosh, I just talked a lot, and that's just the introduction. So every chapter is about the making of something. That's the first kind of thematic chapter to give you a sense of what I'm putting together. And then every other chapter, how to make a university. It's about how international prisoners from around the world, made a university out of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary during World War I. How to make a living, how to make a dress, how to make love. I think about a number of feminists who also found themselves in different places related to revolutionary Mexico and also produced these convergent spaces of revolution. So that's a kind of overview. Yeah.
That's great. And can I ask you, I asked you, you're right, I asked you like 15 questions at once, but one I'm wishing to circle back on a little bit here that you started getting at, but I wonder if you want to speak to more directly, is how you're thinking about internationalism, right? So you talked about kind of the expansion of international capitalism and kind of worldwide, revolutionary impulse and reaction to that. Is there other stuff that you want to say about it that can help us understand, why in your book you're talking mostly about kind of historical events, why that's still a relevant concept for organizers today?
Absolutely. Well, I'll say again, I know we did a big pitch for CPE at the beginning, but here's another one. At the end of writing this book, I really realized how much it was about education and political education. And that was not the book that I set out to write, but it was the one that found me. And what I thought was so extraordinary was all these different spaces where people made internationalism, produced internationalism, where this wasn't so much a kind of governing idea or thought that was impressed upon a group of people, but something in the process of struggle that people made together. So whether it was prisoners who were incarcerated together in Leavenworth, whether it was a number of striking, workers involved in a labor strike in the Imperial Valley in the 1930s, or people who came together from any number of places to form the unemployed councils in the 1930s, or people who came together to produce internationalist art collectives in Harlem, the George Washington Carver School, or in Mexico City, the Taller de Gráfica Popular. I'm very interested in, I should say that the kind of organizing device of the book is convergent spaces. So I'm interested in these socio-spatial sites where people from different revolutionary traditions and different backgrounds were compressed together in struggle, and how they made meaning within struggle, how they were essentially forced to make meaning. And so, I think what's interesting about this is it produces these unanticipated alliances and these unanticipated, new syntheses, these new articulations of struggle. And so the way that we think about internationalism, or the way I started to think about internationalism, was a lot different, just trying to make sense of these different spaces. What I think is valuable is to understand internationalism as something that can be created collaboratively, something that comes out of struggle, something that borrows from a number of different traditions, something that is alive and vibrant and responsive to different moments, not dogma, not something that, is enshrined in any kind of royal text, not something that's simply impressed in people's heads. I think part of what I wanted to do with this book was really rebut a narrative that I was reading in a lot of primary sources and then in a lot of history books, which was that anytime people were talking about a world or a struggle outside of their immediate circumstances, that it was impossible, that it was outside agitators that were putting ideas in their head, or ventriloquizing them. And I think there's just a much richer story of how people come to struggle, how people understand themselves in the world, how people come to relate to, how people produce solidarity. So I think part of what I wanted to do was just capture that process, because I feel like, I mean, some of what I'm describing is the process of producing theory and struggle. And I feel like there's not a lot of snapshots of how that's done by poor, dispossessed, working class people who are usually understood as the kind of inheritors of it rather than the producers of it. So I wanted to write a book about people making internationalism.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And thank you for being willing to circle back on that. I think it's really important. And I would agree. I think it is a really relevant concept for organizers today. And I think it's under theorized, under expressed in most of today's movements, despite the fact that the struggles that most of us are up against are global in nature, are international. And, one of the things that was on my mind while I was reading some of what you sent me was Haiti. So I happen to know that you are trained in part by geographer, and kind of geographical thinking shows up really prominently in your work. And you mentioned Mexico, but I want to talk a little bit about Haiti if we can, just given recent events, from talking about climate disaster to human design disaster at the US border. And the kind of place that Haiti, I think, should have in an internationalist mindset, I feel like is frequently not there, that Haiti does not occupy the kind of primary position in terms of a catalyst of struggle. And I'm not only talking about, the Haitian Revolution, but talking about their practice, the Haitian people's practice of really, really deep internationalism from the time of the revolution to the contemporary period. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, from your perspective, kind of the role that Haiti plays, why Haiti figures prominently in portions of the book.
Sorry, rookie mistake. I'm on mute. Yeah, no, I'm so glad. I'm so glad you asked the question, and I think Haiti has to be at the forefront of all our minds right now. I'm reminded that not long before he died, the geographer Clyde Woods went to Haiti after the 2011 earthquake, and when he came back, he said he'd seen the future, and he meant this in a number of, I think, really devastating ways. But the kind of theft, the kind of active dispossession, the kind of active underdevelopment that was happening in Haiti under everybody's nose, and with the full support of the United States and most of the Western world, he said, was the model, would be the future unless we stopped it. And so I think for anybody thinking about internationalism at this moment, we have to be thinking about Haiti. So Haiti does figure very prominently in the way that I'm charting internationalism, and this is intentional. I think I mentioned before that I mean, I'm a student of social history, but in Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson makes this really extraordinary point where he says, a lot of this history from below, a lot of social history is thought of as this post-war British tradition, E.P. Thompson, Christopher Hill. But he says, you have to think about the work of W.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, of C.L.R. James in Black Jacobins. And as he wrote later, even the work of Black feminists like Pauline Hopkins in the late 19th century as precursors. And I think that there's a whole school of thought that really thinks from that tradition. Like, I think the whole way that you think about history from below and social history changes depending on how it's defined. And in that tradition, Haiti is the center of how you think about abolition. And so there's a number of ways that I think about it. As you said, not just the Haitian Revolution itself, but a whole way in which circulations of capital and surveillance really have to be, located with Haiti at the center. I think about ways that the kind of visions of freedom that were envisioned by Haiti spread around the world and produced their own kind of of internationalist and abolitionist consciousness. So, I talk, for example, about the ways, the ways that leaders of the Haitian Revolution gave shelter and support to struggles against Spanish colonialism, on the condition that every country that was liberated by someone like Simon Bolivar had to have abolition at its heart. And so there's a whole other way that we can think about anti-colonial struggles, if we think about those kind of those interlinkages. And of course, the Haitian Revolution was a key, at heart of abolitionist struggles in the US, throughout the Americas, in the Caribbean. And so what to say? I feel like I'm trying to condense a whole book into a short answer, but the shortest answer is that I absolutely agree. And I think people are right to say that we continue to see the repression of Haiti in relationship to the kind of gifts of internationalism and freedom. It's visions that it's spawned in the world, and so it has to be at the heart. I don't know if that answers everything, and I'd be really curious to hear how Haiti's on your mind too right now.
Yeah, I think Haiti's mostly on my mind in the way that I described in asking the question, in the way that it's been compelled to be in our minds, but also because I think, it's such a kind of stalwart set. The people of Haiti have been so stalwart in resisting imperialism, in objecting to the kinds of interventions that it has been visited by over and over and over, and as has been, I think to your point, also operating with that kind of spirit of internationalism, that spirit of friendship across borders, in demonstrating, kind of how to live revolutionary principles, how to live, kind of from the extension of the abolition of slavery that brought about by the revolution, throughout kind of maintaining its own set of politics, its own attempts to be self-determined, even with endless intervention. Yeah, it's on my mind a lot, and I will say that, to give a little bit of a shout, I know that this event is being sponsored by Bandung Books, so shout to Bandung Books and shout to the Third World Resistance Network. And one of the members of the Third World Resistance Network is Haiti Action Committee, and they've been really, really good about ensuring that Haiti stays on our minds as a place in the present tense that is full of kind of, people's struggle, continuing people's struggle. I'm also, I'm looking at this question that Rob has posed to us, Christina, and I feel like transitioning from Haiti to Cuba is a good thing in this regard, given the geography, but also given the kind of working of US empire in the region and the kind of program of deprivation that both Haiti and Cuba have suffered under for decades at this point. So Rob asks about how the moments of internationalism we've been talking about, I know this is not your historic period, but I have a guess that you have a thought or two about this, how it relates to the 1966 Tricontinental Conference or the 68 Cultural Congress of Havana, or to the publication of Ospal. You have thoughts about any of that?
Ooh, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I wonder if I could just say one more thing before we move off of Haiti, because I feel like, what's one important thing to remember is Haiti doesn't just give us this kind of, like it's not, as you said, just kind of fixed in time in the Haitian Revolution as this, kind of vision of freedom. But I think thinking from Haiti into the, our present day helps us understand the kind of the counter revolution at the heart of capital. One thing that I think falls out of a lot of our discussions are the, reparations that were involved after the abolition of slavery, after, I mean, after enslaved people in Haiti liberated themselves. And those reparations obviously went to former French colonial slave owners who, lost their so-called property in Haiti. And, this wasn't the only country where reparations were paid. Throughout the British colonial world, there was a similar movement for reparations. And I used to help organize radical history walks in England. And the walks were really interesting because they weren't about different abolitionist heroes. They were about really mundane things like train stations, like schools, like factories. And the reason we would point to these elements of the landscape is we would say, this is where the reparations money went. This is where people who laid claim to lost property and were able to get reparations after the abolition of slavery, this is where they invested their money. I mean, you're also a geographer, so you understand the production of space, as the residue of past struggles. And there's so many different ways. I mean, I feel like this is part of my intention in writing the book, that instead of internationalism being this kind of abstract, connection of people in one place connected to the other, it's like the metaphor of the rope. It's thinking about ways that we're already interwoven with the lives and fates of other people, and how the very built environment is the residue of those past struggles. So we're always like, we're conditioned by those spaces, but sometimes we don't always know how to read them. And I think so particularly, instead of the Haitian Revolution just being something that feels like it gets romanticized by lefties that happened a long time ago, we have to think about the counter-revolution of the built environment, the counter-revolution of capital, the counter-revolution of investments, and how that is part of the ongoing punishment for the Haitian Revolution. So I would just add that. But I'm sorry, I totally skipped over the question.
I mean, it's a great segue into this question about Cuba as well. If you want to keep going, I'm here for it.
Yeah, I mean, let me look at the question. Rachel, I told you at the beginning of when we were in the planning stages for this, I was like, I feel like I shot myself in the foot. I'm starting a project in the Haitian Revolution, and I'm going all the way till 1946, and that's like, this is way too much time to cover. And then of course the first question is about 1968 and 2019. So there's so much to say about how it relates to these other moments and these other publications. I'm obviously greatly inspired by those kind of visions. There are similarities, there are differences, there are continuities. I'm just not sure quite the right way in to talk about it, especially as I see the clock turning, but ticking. But I don't know if you have any thoughts particularly about the relevance of these struggles at present.
I mean, my thought is that the question asker here knows dramatically more about the answer to that question than I do. But I do think it's important to talk, for organizers in particular, which is who I know best. I think being mindful of the legacy of these international convenings like Bandung, or like the Tricontinental, or like these cultural convenings that happen on the African continent, or that happened in Latin America, are these places where these seeds of solidarity and of like material solidarity, seeds of internationalism, and I think you've raised an interesting distinction between global solidarity and internationalism. We should come back to that because I think that's a really interesting question. But these seeds of what it means to bind your fates together, essentially, in contradiction to the kind of growing encroachment of imperialism in the period when a lot of these convenings happen, to tie fates together, to act together against the United States, against Europe, I think is really important history, a really important legacy for us. And I know that the dynamics are different these days. And it's not, I don't say that to suggest that like, oh, I'm going to wax poetic for the World Social Forum. We're going to wax poetic. Like we should just have a big international convening and that'll fix everything. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. But what I'm suggesting is a political impulse there that was the motor for those big convenings is something that I think we could still really draw a lot from. Do you have anything else you want to say about that at this point, Christina?
No, I co-sign on everything that you just mentioned.
All right, then I want to ask about these convergent spaces, because as you pointed out, that's a big part of what you're trying to get at in the book. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about the strategy, the writing strategy, the intellectual strategy of putting some of these thinkers and doers in conversation with each other. And you do it in really interesting and unique ways that I think give you like give the reader a fresh look at some of these things. So for instance, you put Frederick Douglass in conversation with Ricardo Flores Magón, or you put Elizabeth Catlett in conversation with the Taller de Gráfica Popular, right? And, even for people who might pay attention to those thinkers or those doers, they may not be thinking, oh yeah, Elizabeth Catlett, yeah, Mexican Revolution, yeah, let's put all those things together. Can you talk a little bit about the strategy in doing that and elevate this conception of convergent spaces a bit more for us?
Sure. Thanks for the very rich question. I, you know, I'll try to answer in kind of two parts. And the first part is about the theorists, right? So the piece I gave you about that starts with Haiti really focuses on this like marvelous piece that Frederick Douglass wrote called The Revolutions of 1848, which he wrote in 1848, which he delivered at an abolitionist event that year. And what's extraordinary about it is this year marked the 10th year of his own freedom after he had emancipated himself. And I think his viewers his audience was expecting for him to talk about abolitionist struggles. And what the talk does is it takes us around the world. It thinks about the revolutions of 1848 that were happening in Western Europe. It thinks about struggles against colonialism that are happening, in Ireland, in Kenya. He's thinking about struggles against imperialist US aggression in Mexico, right? He's thinking about these all together. He says, and he kind of weaves them together, thinking about the tyrants of the old world and the slaveholders of our own. And imagines a world tied together in struggle. He has this wonderful line that says, the wide world has become a whispering gallery. I think part of putting some of these thinkers in dialogue, it really just underscores the kind of internationalist connections that they were drawing themselves that are sometimes overlooked. Frederick Douglass is not often seen as somebody who was thinking so deeply about how struggle against slavery related to struggles against military aggression against Mexico, or struggles against capitalist exploitation in British mills. And he's thinking about these things all together. And so, putting him and his thoughts in dialogue with, other thinkers, like you said, Ricardo Flores Magón, I think really just intensifies those kind of connections. So I'll say that as that's not accidental. I also think that there's a kind of regrettable trend, in some of these books where people say, who's your theorist? And they really mean like, what French philosopher, justifies all these connections. And, so to say, well, W.B. Du Bois is my key theorist, I think itself a kind of intervention into that logic. But the second part of what I say in relationship to convergent spaces is, in the tradition of social history, we say that if you want to find the record of how people lived, right? Not the industrialists, not the presidents who have great archives of their lives, but where the working class was, there's parts of the archive you have to go to. Sometimes you have to go to the records of the prison, the records of welfare rolls, the records where people are kept when they end up in records. And so some of calling attention to very key figures like Ricardo Flores Magón is also a way of saying, like, let's go with him into Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, where he ultimately dies, where a lot of people have argued, and I agree, that he was killed, right? And how do we understand the kind of universe, the convergence that was happening there? And I'll just say very briefly, because there are just questions popping up as I'm talking. The story of Leavenworth, the convergent space of Leavenworth, is one. It happens during World War I, where all these political crimes of sedition and dissent become federal crimes. And so basically everybody who was organizing against anything ended up in this prison together, whether they were Mexican revolutionaries, pacifists, socialists, communists, wobblies, Indian Gadarites. They were all in the same prison together. And so what my research has shown was that the people were organizing together. They were educating together. They formed their own university. The Department of Justice called Leavenworth Penitentiary a university of radicalism, because so many people were going in and coming out as organizers. And so, I went into those archives trying to follow Ricardo Flores Magón. And when I came out, I had a whole story of the convergent space that was produced there. So the intention is kind of twofold, both to follow those theorists, and also by following those theorists, I think there's a whole universe of internationalism that gets revealed.
Yeah, it's interesting, Christina, when you were talking about the archives of the people, I was thinking, that your book does that in such a lovely way by talking about these kind of material products too, right? Like how to make a whatever. And Pete has asked us a question here that speaks to some of that, so I want to raise that up. So Pete says, fascinated, intrigued by your use of objects like the rope to represent material representations of struggle. I'm curious what examples from the current globalized moment and supply chain interruptions that are hitting first world economies in this pandemic moment you see as lessons for our work. And I know this is something you have thought about, so I'm going to let you have at that.
Sure. Well, thanks, Pete, for the question. Yeah, I mean, and I think the answer is in the question. I think one thing that the pandemic has underscored is that, if we had a kind of shorthand caricature of the contradictions of capitalism at this moment that were kind of contained in the shopping cart, what does it mean for people to have to live their whole lives in these, the wealthy cities and this wealthy planet? What does it mean for people to have to live their lives in shopping carts? That was the key kind of contradiction of this moment. I would definitely say that it's the container truck at this, the pandemic has revealed that the contradictions are in the container truck, and there's any number of ways we can think about it. Rachel, you're in New York. I left New York not too long ago, and being in the pandemic, it was impossible not to think about the presence of container trucks. Not least because, they were, people were getting groceries individually delivered, groceries, other kind of goods, while some people were getting nothing. But also because, very early on in the pandemic, the container trucks were being used as kind of de facto morgues when those were full at different hospitals or in different funeral homes. And I think the container trucks really became, I think, this profound metaphor for the dysfunction of the modern capitalist world, because, at the beginning of the pandemic, we all ran out of toilet paper, even though, nobody ran out of it. The problem was a kind of, was that it was cheaper to deliver the goods than it was to store them. And so I think it brought attention to just a whole universe of underpaid drivers, underpaid logistic workers, underpaid people in warehouses, underpaid people who, are like at every node of the processing and transportation and storage and delivery. Like, this is a ruthless, merciless economy that's often very difficult to think about all at once. And the container truck helped us understand how cheap commodities made out of brutal, extractive and exploitative regimes in other places get transported, in brutal, exploitative ways, and then get stored, delivered, with another level of just diabolical inequality. And so, if we had to think about a commodity that helps us envision the struggle over internationalism, it would have to be the container truck now.
And so, Pete, I'm sure you can see now why I am a Christina Heatherton super fan. Like, that's just so beautifully and eloquently said, Christina. And I feel like it's crystal clear, right? You managed to compress all of this really, all these big ideas, these really important and powerful ideas down into something that's very clear and understandable. So thank you for that. We're starting to get close to our time here. So I'm going to ask you just one other thing, which I feel like is probably the dreaded, job talk question kind of. So, but we're friends. We'll act as if it's just regular conversation between us. So I'm really interested if you think there's any relationship or there's any conscious arc between work that you've done. So Hasmin was introducing you as having done these projects, these collaborative projects with Jordan Camp, who I know is here with us tonight, on policing. So you wrote, you edited a really powerful collection called Policing the Planet. But you've also done these readers in collaboration with the community in Skid Row in Los Angeles. And I'm just wondering if you think there's some kind of through line there, or there are nodes to connect between this work, this historical work, and this contemporary work that you've been doing previously.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for prefacing it as a job interview question, because that's exactly what it feels like. But there's a number of ways I could answer. Some I think would take longer than others. So maybe I'll just cut to the quick and say, internationalism was a concept devised by Jeremy Bentham, somebody who's mostly known for his theories of the panopticon. And in a chapter, I really think through actually that tension and what that means, and how, in order to understand internationalism, we have to think about this kind of countervailing line of sight, the line of capital. The panopticon wasn't Jeremy Bentham's idea. It was actually his brother's idea. And it was part of these efforts to try to discipline and, basically minimize loss among shipbuilders in England. And so, there was this customary practice where people would take chips of wood when they were building a ship, and they would use it to, as firewood, or they would build furniture, just kind of like it was a customary thing. If you worked 12 hours a day, you could, take a few of the chips home. And this became a criminalized act. And so somebody like Samuel Bentham created all these different mechanisms, that we understand related to prisons as, ways of managing and surveilling labor. So, I've there's a long story. I'm not sure I can totally condense, but I think that it's actually very helpful to think about those impulses on behalf of capital to discipline people, to make sure that they are not surviving, they're not communicating with each other, and certainly that they're not organizing, and certainly that they're not organizing across space. Like to think about the disciplinary mechanisms as being the inverse of where internationalism comes from. There's a line of sight that I feel like is involved in the consolidation of capitalist interests across borders, around the world. And internationalism, I think there's something very generative in thinking about it as the contradiction of that line of sight. And when those things are seen in kind of dialectical opposition, when those things are seen together, then internationalism doesn't become this kind of hopeless, project that we, that is meek and small, that we hope is, it can be built by people, but something that is as big, as grand as the fears, basically as capitalists fear it to be. So I think that's the history I'm trying to tell.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I promised Hasmin that would be our last question, but I do want to give big, big, big thanks to Christina Heatherton for sharing her work with us, for talking about the new book with us. And I hope that all of you will join me in pounding down the doors of UC Press when the book is released next year. So thank you so, so much, Christina.
Thank you,
Thank
Rachel.
you. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Hasmin.
Thank you both, Rachel and Christina, for this very thought-provoking conversation / revolutionary love fest. We're all here for it. And for both of your contributions to really deepening the analysis of our movement so that we can fight more strategically in these urgent times. We look forward to the publication of your book, Christina, and rest assured that we too will also be spreading the word far and wide among our comrades when it comes out. Thanks to our co-sponsors at Eastside Arts Alliance, Bandung Books, the Third World Resistance Network. Many thanks to our captioner, Mary, our interpreters, Yaya and Leah, and everyone who joined us today, whether you're in the Bay, the East Coast, or anywhere around the world. And as Rachel mentioned, these events are only made possible by the contributions of and support of our friends and comrades. So we encourage you to donate to CPE if you can, and we'll be dropping the link in the chat box. Stay tuned for our next and final event of the year, featuring Sonia Vaz Borges on her book, Militant Education, Liberation Struggle, Consciousness, which takes as its focus the political education program of the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. We're looking forward to that. It's on November 30 at 12 p.m. Pacific time. Mark your calendars and see you there. Thank you everyone for joining us, and long live international solidarity.